one of the rabbis of Beth Tzedek Congregation in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Conversations Over Coffee. Today we'll be speaking with Dawit Demoz. Dawit is a former refugee from Eritrea. He lived in Israel for more than 6 years before finally moving to Canada in 2016. He's currently a candidate for a Master of Arts degrees in Developmental Studies at York University, and he works as a refugee sponsorship trainer at the Refugee Sponsorship Training Program. Dawit, it's so wonderful to have you here. As I said to you privately just a moment ago, I know that we had to reschedule our conversation because of a loss in your family. We want to extend our condolences to you on that.
Thank you so much.
I think we should start from, the very beginning. Tell us, a lot of people might not be familiar with Eritrea and its history and all the conflict that's going on there between Eritrea and Ethiopia. So let's just start with a little bit of basic history. Tell us about Eritrea, its where it is, its government, and why it was that you and other young people and others to this very day are fleeing there as refugees.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Rabbi. And it's a very complicated history. Again, I'm not a historian, and I'm sure some people in the audience might know better than me in the history of Eritrea and Ethiopia and the Horn in general. But with the limited knowledge I have, I'll try to break down the historical events and what led to the Eritrean exodus, and of course to the current war with Ethiopia. So Eritrea was colonized for centuries by the Greece, by the Turkish, by the Italians, briefly by the English, and by Ethiopians since 1950. In 1960s, in 1961 to be specific, the Eritreans started an independence movement against the Ethiopians at that time. So Eritrea was part of Ethiopia. And in 1961, Eritrean independence movement started, and it ended in 1991. So in 1991, Eritrea became independent. In 1993, there was a referendum where more than 99% of Eritreans voted for independence, and Eritrea became independent state and separated from Ethiopia. And since then, after independence, a temporary government was selected. There was no election, not by election, but temporary government was established. And in 1997, a constitution was drafted. In 1998, was expected to have the first election, but unfortunately, the rebel leader who defeated the Ethiopian dictator and helped Eritrea to be independent refused to implement the constitution, and to avoid conducting election, Eritrea broke again war with Ethiopia. So before I explain what happened after that, just to give a little bit of context, why Eritrea went again into war with Ethiopia. So Ethiopia, including Eritrea, was one country ruled by an ethnic group in Ethiopia. It's called Amhara. So it's the second biggest ethnic group in Ethiopia that dominated the Ethiopian politics for centuries until 1991. So in 1960s, when the Eritrean freedom movement started, there was also a freedom movement from a small region called Tigray in Ethiopia, which is the war zone now. I'll make the connections in a little bit. But these two rebel groups cooperated to remove the Ethiopian dictator from power. So the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, it's called EPLF, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, these two rebel groups cooperated and removed the Ethiopian dictator in 1991. So the Eritrean rebel groups had more power than the Ethiopian rebel groups, the TPLF. And so when the dictator in Ethiopia was removed, Eritreans decided to be independent. They chose to be separated from Ethiopia and to be independent. And like I said, Eritrea became independent. But the Tigray rebel group had a decision to make, whether like Eritrea to be independent or to control Ethiopia by making a coalition with other rebel groups. So they ended up dominating Ethiopia. They established a coalition group with other minority rebel groups, and the Tigray People's Liberation Front created a coalition party to rule Ethiopia. So at the beginning, with the two rebel groups, there was a tension, a power tension, and that's what led to the war in 1998. I remember I was 12 years old when the war broke out in 1998. It was very bloody war. Close to 100,000 people died. And so since then, Ethiopia was more powerful, and diplomatically and politically and in the war, the Eritrean government was defeated, and the Ethiopian government was more popular at that time. And so the two former allied rebel groups became enemies since 1998. And between 1991 until 2018, the TPLF, a group from Western Ethiopia, controlled the Ethiopian politics. But there was a resistance, a demonstration since 2015 from groups that were not happy to be dominated by a very small population of the Ethiopian population. So Tigray is only 6% of Ethiopian population, whereas the Amhara and the Oromos are the two biggest ethnic groups. So since 2015, there was huge demonstrations against the Ethiopian government. And eventually in 2018, a new prime minister came, who's both from the Oromo and from the Amhara. So to cool down these demonstrations, a new prime minister was selected. Again, there was no election. Was selected by the parliament. And for the first time in about 20 years, the new prime minister eased the tension with Eritrea. So there was a peace deal between Eritrea and Ethiopia.
Yeah, for which the Ethiopian prime minister won a Nobel Peace Prize.
Exactly. So the Ethiopian new prime minister, looking back now, I'm confident to say that he fooled the world, and he fooled the Nobel Peace Committee. And of course, we as Ethiopians and Eritreans were also fooled because he was really optimistic. There was a passion. Many political prisoners and journalists were released in Ethiopia. Again, the tension with Eritrea was quote unquote solved, and there was hope. But unfortunately, even though the Ethiopian new prime minister was making these reforms, there was zero reform in Eritrea. So the Eritrean government was still detaining tens of thousands of political prisoners, including members of his cabinet, his government. About 15 of them were arrested since 2001, and there was no sign of releasing them. Journalists were in prison until then. So it eventually became clear that this peace deal was not healthy. And this peace deal also excluded the TPLF the group, they were former allies of the Eritrean government because of their tension, because of their power conflict in the past 27 years. The peace deal didn't include this northern Ethiopia's group who led the Ethiopian politics until 2008. So there was a tension. And the reason the tension between the federal Ethiopian government and the former Ethiopian government, but now since 2008, federal provincial government in the Western Ethiopia, the new prime minister wants to have a central government, like in Eritrea, that controls every corner of Ethiopia. Whereas the previous government had a federalism, a federal government, like the same we have in Canada. So there are provinces and they have power for autonomy and self-determination. And so it became clear when the new prime minister went to destroy the federalism and create a centralism government in order to easily control the Ethiopian politics. So that was a sign of dictatorship. And that's why the former Ethiopian government and now the Tigray region, the Tigray province's government refused to, they resisted. So when the Ethiopian government postponed the election, that Tigray region refused to postpone the election, and they ended up having their own election. And so the tension led into war. Exactly.
So one of the things that we know, as you said, about Eritrea is that there's never been elections. The ruler, how do you pronounce his name?
Isaias Afwerki.
Isaias Afwerki
Right.
has compulsory military service. There's all sorts of conscripts are often 15 years old. And there's all sorts of evidence of torture and sex trade, human slavery, and so forth. It's among the worst offenders of human rights in the world. How old were you when you left Eritrea? And tell us about what caused you to finally decide to leave, and tell us about your journey.
Yeah, that's right, Rabbi. So, like I said, when Eritrea became independent in 1993, in 1995, the Eritrean government started a national service. It's kind of similar to what Israel has, compulsory national service. It was meant to be only for 18 months. So all young people who finished high school would go to the national service for 18 months and they would be released, right? So that was the hope. And for the first 2 or 3 years, that was the case. But because the war with Ethiopia broke out in 1998, since then the national service became indefinite, pretty much. Once you finish high school, it doesn't matter if you're 15 or 16 or even younger than that, you must go to the national service. And a large number of students go to the national service every year. And pretty much you remain in the army indefinitely. And the conditions in the army are many former governments and army leaders who eventually escaped from Eritrea called the conditions in the army as a slave labor. It's pretty much you work in the army and 24/7 work in the army, in agricultural fields, in construction. And this is all to benefit the army commanders, not to benefit the country. The people doesn't get anything from it. The entire economy in Eritrea is controlled by the government, by the regime. So nothing, no construction, no telecommunication, no any business companies in Eritrea are controlled by the civilians. So like I said, the country is militarized. So if 10,000 to 20,000 young people goes to the army every year, you can imagine how many people are in the army. And the government spends the highest budget, not that we know there is a formal budget every year, but the highest budget goes to intelligence services. So the government knows what's happening in every corner of the country.
It's
easy
it's intelligence
for them to
services in the sense of it's internal security, and
it's internal security, it's spies, and that leads to how my life was affected, and what caused me to leave. So in 2015, I finished high school. I was 18 years old then. I went to the army with about other 10,000 young students. In 2005, we went to the army, and I took basic military training for about a year. By the end of that year, there was this exam. We call it a matriculation exam. That's a secondary exam that determines whether or not you can stay in the army forever, or you can go to other military colleges. So there was one university until 2013. That university was closed. So the government opened a number of colleges that are run by the military and have military discipline within those. So it's another way of controlling young people, but they call it college, and they decide for you what to study. And so I was lucky to be one of the around 3,000 out of the 10,000 students that was released from the army and sent to this military college. So they decided for me to study microbiology. So I studied microbiology for 2 years. And after 2 years, I was forced to withdraw from the college and to be sent to a very high political cadre course, basically to be a spy for the government. So when I said the budget for the intelligence, like you clarified, Rabbi, it's for internal spies, like basically for me to be an ear and eyes for the government, to report what my friends, my family, my schoolmates, and what they are saying about the government and who's dangerous for the government. And after that course, it's a very sensitive course. You can't tell anybody that you took that course, because if you tell them, they know that you're part of the government and you're the spy, and people won't say anything, and you wouldn't be able to.
It's kind of hard to do. It's kind of hard to do that job if everybody knows who you are.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. So it's also risky. So if somehow you released any information about the course we took, or what kind of expectations there was on us,
that puts you in danger.
That puts you in danger. So
was that the impediment, the motivation for you to leave?
Absolutely, yeah. So after I finished that course, we were allowed to go on a vacation, quote unquote, just see our families for 2 weeks. And within those 2 weeks, I escaped to Ethiopia. And one of the reasons that the Eritrean government hated the former government of Ethiopia is that the Eritrean government blames for encouraging young Eritreans to escape Eritrea in order to weaken the Eritrean government. There's probably some truth to it, but mainly most Eritreans leave the country because of the conditions in the country, because of the forced labor, because of the lack of freedom, and many more.
What I've read about Eritrea is that it's the leadership is very paranoid about security and the border, and people fleeing it. Some compare it to North Korea in terms of that same kind of paranoia and absolute control. So you when you fled, you went to Israel originally. You were part of that first group of Eritreans that sought refugee status in Israel. What was you were in Israel for 6 years?
Right.
What What was that like for you?
So in many ways, Rabbi, I've never been to North Korea, and I only know from what I read in North Korea, but um, I would say the conditions in Eritrea are a lot worse than North Korea. It's very underestimated to call Eritrea North Korea of Africa in many ways, and so. Yes, so like many young Eritreans, I think up until very recently, up to 5,000 Eritreans were leaving Eritrea every month. And so many people go to Europe through Libya. They pay money for smugglers from Ethiopia to Sudan, from Sudan to Libya, and then to Europe. But unfortunately, in 2009, that's the year that I left Eritrea, there was an agreement between the Italians and Gaddafi at that time, the Libyan dictator. And so the coast of Mediterranean Sea was closed. There was no way to jump on a risky boat and to go to Europe. So many of us had to find another journey, another country that we can go to. And that's where the journey of Eritrean refugees to Israel begins. It begins around 2007, where a few Eritreans from Sudan and Egypt would cross the Sinai border and went to Israel. But many of us started in 2009 when the path to Europe was closed. So I myself was at the refugee in Ethiopia for a few months, and I realized that many of the things that I couldn't find in Eritrea, freedom of movement, the freedom to work, to go to school, more importantly, I couldn't find them at the refugee camp. It was a very isolated place with no enough resources, even basic resources like food and healthcare and things like that. So I wanted to go to Europe. My hope was to go to Europe and to study. But like I said, I even went to Libya, right? I didn't only knew that the agreement between Gaddafi and the Italians was in place. There was no place. I went to Libya. I really wanted to go to Europe. But unfortunately, in 2009, like I said, because of that agreement, there was no way to cross Mediterranean Sea, and went back to Egypt from Libya and crossed the Sinai border to Israel. This was in late 2009. And I was in prison at the beginning for about 3 months, and I was released and sent to South Tel Aviv, and that's where I spent most of my time for 6.5 years until I moved to Canada. And unfortunately, the Israeli government considers most Eritreans and other African refugees as economic migrants. So the Israeli government doesn't recognize Eritreans and Sudanese and many other Africans as refugees. So there is no
refugee status that
social,
right?
Yeah, so there is no refugee status, but also there is no the basic rights that comes with refugee status, including the right to work and healthcare and other.
I remember that time. I was in my previous position at USCJ, United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism. One of the things that we did with the Conference of Presidents and major Jewish organizations is several times we went to South Tel Aviv, and we learned about the circumstances that were going on and tried to advocate with the Israeli government for better treatment for refugees. It was, in my perspective, the designation of economic migrants versus refugees was a way for Israel to have to avoid dealing with the refugee issue, which was an embarrassment for a country of people that know what it's like to be refugees and have nobody willing to open up their borders to them. It was an embarrassment that Israel treated the Eritrean refugees in that way. But you were there for 6 years, and then you finally made it to Canada.
That's right.
Your family, though, is still, well, they're not in Eritrea now. They're in Ethiopia, I believe, right? And in fact, Beth Tzedek is the sponsoring organization for your family to come to Canada. Tell us a little bit about your family's journey. They were in the midst of the Tigray region for quite a few months. What are you hearing from your family? Where are they now? Where are we in the process of getting them to come to Canada?
Yeah, just a little bit to add to what you said about refugees in Israel, Rabbi. The number at the beginning was about 60,000 Eritreans and Sudanese and some other West African citizens. Now the number is down to close to 30,000. And like you said, for Israel with its economy and high demand for employment, it would have been easy and an asset even for Israel to provide refugee status and asset to the population over there. But to go back to Eritrea and my family, one of the ways the Eritrean government punished the Eritrean citizens is when a family member leaves, the government punished the remaining family members. So when I left, my family was at risk. So the Eritrean government punished by imprisoning them, by asking them a lot of money, like around 50,000 Eritrean currency, which in dollars is very, close to $3,000, $4,000, but almost impossible for an oppressed family for centuries to get that amount of money and pay for the government. And so many families follow their family members to leave the country because it's not safe for them. And as a result, my dad left, my mom left, my dad's family left Eritrea, and they've been at the refugee camp in Ethiopia for 3-4 years until the war broke out. The recent in November 2020, when the federal government of Ethiopia and the Eritrean government partnered to defeat the former Ethiopian government and now the Tigray provincial government, and the entire region became a war zone. And the 4 refugee camps that hosted close to 100,000 Eritrean refugees became a war zone. And my family, my immediate family, my dad's family, my stepmom and my siblings, and my other close family members were in those refugee camps. And many refugees were killed. Many refugees were abducted by the Eritrean government. When you leave Eritrea by the Eritrean government, you're considered as a traitor. And so many refugees were abducted. There were reports that up to 20,000 refugees have disappeared from the refugee camps, and it's not clear where they are and what's happening to them. Many of them left the refugee camp and they escaped to the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa. The Eritrean government is all over Ethiopia now. Many are saying the intelligence system in Ethiopia is controlled by the Eritrean government. And so it would be risky for my family to say where exactly they are, but they're out of the conflict region, from the war zone. They are in a safer place, but there are challenges for them, even though their sponsorship process, much appreciation to Bethsedec and the refugee committee to sponsor my family. Unfortunately, because of the COVID situation, because of the travel restrictions in Canada, but also because of the political situation in Ethiopia now, it's very difficult to process their application and to bring them to Canada. So Ethiopia is a mess now. Not only the conflict in the Tigray region, but similar conflicts have spread to the rest of the country. And so, like I said, because of the COVID-19 situation, because of Canada's travel restriction, and because of the visa process that the host country is supposed to provide to refugees, it has been very unclear and very concerning for arrivals of many Eritrean refugees that are in process to come to Canada.
What are the steps that we can take to try to help this along?
I mean, like I said, it's if it was up to the Canadian government only, I would say, you know, the government of Canada should fast track the application processes for Eritrean refugees to come to Canada as soon as possible. And maybe that still is something that we should try. But it also depends on the Ethiopian political crisis. For refugees, in order to come to Canada, they need a travel document and a visa, an exit visa from the host country, which is the Ethiopian government. And with the involvement of the Eritrean government in Ethiopia and with the political uncertainty in Ethiopia, that might be difficult even for the Canadian government to do so.
We're going a little bit over our allotted time. I want to ask you a question that if you would prefer not to speak about, we certainly understand, but I think it's important for people to understand that we're talking about life and death. And not only are there reports of 20,000 people disappearing from the refugee camps and of murder and again, human slavery and sex trafficking and everything bad that you can imagine is going on in this area. And so the fact that your family is still safe is a miracle in many ways. We hope it stays that way. But there's also an emotional toll on the people who go through this. And when I wished you condolences earlier, it was because you had a family member that took his own life as a result of, we can assume, the anxiety and stress of this, as well as likely other mental health issues that went along with that. Are you able to talk a little bit about that, or and as I said, if that's something you prefer not to talk about, it's by all means pass on it.
Yeah, no, I can talk about it. The war in Ethiopia at the moment, especially for the Tigray region, is really concerning. It's not getting the attention that it should be getting. Up to 5 million people are in need of urgent assistance. 1 to 2 million people have been displaced within Ethiopia. 150,000 people are reported to be killed, only civilians, and more than 63,000 people have fled to Sudan, and rape and starvation is being used as a weapon of war. And not only the people that are in Tigray, but the people who have family members in Tigray all over the world have been impacted by this war. And my cousin was not even living at the refugee camp. My cousin was living in Ethiopia. He was a young, he was only 26 years old. He was a bright kid. He was a source of pride and income to my cousin, to my uncle. And he was the last person I was worried about. I was worried about his family. I was worried about my family in Ethiopia. But I was not worried about him. But you've been witnessing all the atrocities that I've just mentioned, and you've been watching videos of people being killed, army officers proudly taking pictures of themselves killing civilians, and so yeah, he couldn't handle that, and so yeah, he took his own life, and his family, my uncle's family, is still in the war zone, with no access to food and other basic needs, with complete blackout of internet and power and water. And so he's gone, but his family is still in that war zone. And his last words were, "Please take care of my family." And his family are there still in the war, and it's just heartbreaking, not about his passing, but also the current situation of his family.
We're so sorry for your loss, Dawit, and thank you for sharing that with us, to give us a sense of the real human toll that these conflicts are taking place, or that these conflicts inevitably lead to, that are taking place around the world, especially in Eritrea and in Ethiopia. We at Bet Tzedek, this is our second refugee sponsorship. And we've done it because we have people in our community who are committed to the idea that as Jews, as people who have experienced atrocities through the Holocaust, and also the challenge of refugee status. Canada, though, is good to the Jews today, wasn't always that way. There's a book that one of our members wrote, One is Too Many, that immediately after the war, Canada did not have a very open policy for Jews to come here. Thankfully, that's changed. And we're committed to this because as a people that have suffered, we know what that suffering is like, and we understand an obligation to help address that. And so we're really proud of the members of our shul that have spearheaded this work as lay leaders, and all the members of the shul that raised the $50,000 that was needed, quite frankly, to bring the family here. And we're ready, as soon as we can get your family here, we're ready to welcome them and to put them up in a place for 2 years and support and all the things that are necessary for that. What I would say to our viewing audience is, if you want to find out more, I'm sure you can contact Dawit directly. He'll be happy to engage you. And from time to time, we'll continue to have programs with him through our Refugee Sponsorship Awareness Program so that you can find out more. But now the only thing that we can do is we can impress upon our government the importance of fast-tracking refugee application statuses and using whatever diplomatic leverage they might have in order to work with Ethiopia in particular, and perhaps other countries in which there are refugees waiting to come to Canada, in order to fast-track that, and to bring people out of harm's way and into safety. And we know, as our government has said, that the growth of Canada is going to be dependent upon immigration, both from skilled laborers as well as from a policy of welcome for those that are currently in refugee circumstances. So with that, I'm going to say, Dawit, thank you. This conversation obviously is going to be ongoing. 40 minutes does not do it justice. Thank you for sharing with us your personal experience and that of your family. I'd like to say to everyone else, be sure to check out all the activities and opportunities for engagement at Bet Tzedek, www.beth-tzedek.org. Just want to highlight next Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Join our artists in residence, Aviva Chernick, and the Arts and Prayer Lab for Bri Ah, a half-day celebration of arts and of all kinds of arts, where we'll have an opportunity to see the presentation of people from our arts and prayer labs, participate with them, and involve ourselves in the creativity of our spirit. For everything else, again, be sure to check us out online. Thanks everyone for joining us. Bye-bye. Shavuot Tov. Have a good